Hey everybody, a while back we did a custom liquid cooling building sponsored by Alphacool, and we put it into an InWin 905 case. Now they also sent us a bunch of hardline tubing and fittings, so we went ahead and upgraded the system and also put it into a InWin 925. So we've got the build done, we've got some shots coming up here. Let's go ahead and take a look. Now, the hardline build was much more complex than the soft tubing. You've got to deal with things like saws to cut the hardline tubing. You have to use a heat gun in order to get the bends. Alphacool also sent us their Eisbecher kit in order to get the proper bending angles, 45 degrees, 90 degrees, 180, whatever it took for us. We were able to use that kit, which made things a lot easier. But it is a lot more work than a soft tubing kit. And you definitely have to take your time and plan things out ahead of time. It took me a couple iterations to figure out exactly the loop that I wanted. I went ahead and went with a kind of a combination series and parallel loop where the CPU and video card are in parallel, but the rest of the system is in series. Now we're still using our AMD Ryzen 7 3800X paired up with a RTX 2070 Super. Now, both of those components were in our previous build, so we've utilized those same cooling components, but we've upgraded our radiators in this build. The previous build in the 905 just used a single 360 and a 240 at the front. This build uses a 360 up top and up front, so we've got a little better performance in this build as well. So in this iteration of the build, we went again with a parallel loop. It's a pretty basic design though, and in all honesty, it's probably the most simple design that we could have gone with for this case. Now, to start out, the loop actually begins here with the pump and reservoir combo. We've got a couple ports that we're utilizing in this build. Number one, we've got a input here that we're using as our fill and drain port, and we've got that capped off with a little bit of a ball valve here so that we can access the fluid in the system should we need to. So the output is actually slightly behind that output, and we're actually using some soft tubing for this because that soft tube actually goes back behind the graphics card and into the GPU block here. And that's where things get kind of interesting, and we go from a series loop into parallel. Now the flow of our system goes not only through the GPU's channels here to keep the GPU cool, but it also splits and goes up to our CPU block and then back down to the GPU. Now those two streams come back together and make kind of a curve, a 90-degree curve, and then another 90 straight up into our first radiator. Now that first radiator obviously circulates the coolant through the radiator and then comes out at a 90-degree bend here and straight back all the way to our front reservoir. I'm sorry, our front radiator. The fluid makes a loop through that radiator and then down and into the top of our reservoir combo. Now we're using dual 360 millimeter radiators in this build, whereas the first generation of this build in the InWin 905 actually used a single 360 at the bottom and a single 240 at the front. With the InWin 925, we're using a 360 at the top and a 360 at the front. Now you'll notice most of the bends in this case are pretty simple. You know, we've got a couple 45s here at the reservoir and radiator junction. We're also using some 45 degrees off of the CPU block to the GPU. These are pretty basic bends, but they were certainly made easier with Alphacool's ice coffer kit that we were sent as well. We've got another 90-degree bend here, but really that's it for the bends. And I'm really happy that that's kind of the design choice I went with, because bending tubing for your first build can be a little intimidating. And these simple bends, you know, really we ended up with 4 bends total, made this build process so much easier, even though it was a little stressful and time consuming to get those bends and tube lengths right. If you just take your time though and measure things out and, you know, measure twice, cut once, that type of thing, your build will go much, much better. Now the straight connections, obviously we have the long connection here over between radiators. That was a super easy cut and length there. And then we have a short piece here to just kind of give us some length and view into our setup. I really hope you enjoyed this video. It was a lot of fun doing this build. It was my first ever hardline build, and although I, you know, ran into a couple snags here and there with tubing lengths and getting the build angles just right, the bends, and using the heat gun for the first time, I really had a good time doing this. So I hope you guys enjoyed this content. If you do, give it a thumbs up, consider giving us a subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.